Hey folks, it's author MJ Gallagher here, and welcome back to the series where I'll be talking about the development and behind the scenes content from my new book, Greek Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII. Thank you as always to everyone who backed that project on Kickstarter. It's very, very much appreciated. I'm joined again today by my good friend and fellow Final Fantasy VII lore deviant, Schrodinger's baby seal.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm good. I like lore deviant. I think I'm gonna get that on my tombstone.
Nice. I liked it when it popped into my head the other day, and I thought I'm definitely going with that. So obviously, it has been quite a number of weeks since we last sat down. First of all, mega apologies to individuals that have been waiting on this podcast. I've sort of kind of highlighted it on social media and Kickstarter and whatnot, but I tested positive for COVID. Wasn't too serious, the effects of it, but I ended up with a persistent cough for a few weeks, which effectively ruled me out of recording, because I think for most people, my accent makes it quite difficult to listen to at the best of times. So with this cough going on every 30 seconds, it would have been a nightmare. So, so all better now, and just apologies again for the delay on that. But I did make use of the time, as much as, I was spluttering away. It did mean that I could focus on writing a bit more rather than the recording side. So I was kind of working on the book, obviously, but also managed to squeeze in a couple of scripts for my Final Fantasy VII Remake video series, for Chapter 17. So that was good to kind of have a look at, the opening of Chapter 17 with Aerith's Room and the combat simulator, including Vice as well, and then do a second episode which effectively just covers the drum scenario. So it was good. It was good to be able to kind of sit down and do that. I also did a charity auction last weekend, with the guys at Final Fantasy Artist Auction. One of those is my good friend Liam Mulvey, who's the narrator on the audiobooks that I've released. But he also plays Libertas Ostium in the Final Fantasy 15 series.
Tremendous voice, yes.
He's such an amazing guy as well. I do love Liam. And I was blown away. I did a short interview with the guys, and at the end of it, sort of auctioned off a signed hardback copy of Norse Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, and it went for $135.
Oh,
which it blew my mind. So that was a guy called the Zen Reaction who made that donation, and it went to a charity in British Columbia for First Nations charity. So
that's excellent.
So absolutely delighted.
That's a joy to hear. That's I participate in that culture quite directly. My wife is First Nations individual, and I participate in ceremony, and I will be going to Sundance this year. So wow. That's a really I'm remiss to think of a group that deserves help more than that one. So that's heartwarming to hear.
So it's I was blown away by what the Zen Reaction contributed, and it was nice to be able to play my part in that. And the auction itself, over the course of, I think it was 3 or 4 hours that it ran for, they managed to raise $18,000 all in. So
wow,
that'll be going to the First Nations charity, and just it's an excellent, exactly as you say, it's an excellent cause, and no one. Or there are few organisations that need it more at this time.
Yes, absolutely.
And what about yourself? Have you been up to much kind of stream-wise or anything else these last few weeks?
Yeah, so, it's been the season of brutal Souls-type games. We both had Elden Ring, which, is sort of the apex of the Souls series. It's an open world Souls game, and very likely one of the best experiences ever authored.
Wow.
And so I spent some time streaming that, making some content for that, and I probably have content for years to come from that. And then in Final Fantasy news, we also had Stranger of Paradise come out, and so I consumed that with the fervor that I consume things, and so I
don't think I would expect anything less of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I do have our good friend Legions, Blitz, and Fish Fried Cat are all going to be on a Stranger of Paradise themed podcast with
Amazing.
me, a SEAL Team 7 episode that will be at the time of this recording probably out and ready. It's going to be we're going to be recording it Monday, and then the following week I've got FF Weekly Pod, Drew Kreisman and Sector 6 sitting in a room together and trying not to kill each other while talking about Final Fantasy, and that's going to definitely be a fun time.
I hope so. I've got a lot of time for the Kreisman boys and for Sector 6 as well. And obviously, it's social media is evidence that they don't see eye to eye, but I think both parties have very valid opinions, and it'll be good. It'll be good to actually listen to them.
I think so. I think it'll be fun, and I think when the rubber meets the road, there's very little seriousness, to the whole thing. So I imagine that good ideas will happen, and that's because that's how they happen.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, so there's that. We've had kind of a dry news season. There's at the day of this recording, we found out that E3 was officially canceled, so it looks like that what news we will get regarding future titles, etc., is going to come in probably a different form, which is fine. It's a season of change. I am hearing through the grapevine that we're going to have Ever Crisis to talk about fairly soon, and so that's going to be a lot of content for my listeners and for probably yours. So
I'm looking forward to that. Obviously, one of the big things that happened last week was that First Soldier got Genesis and Minerva skins.
That's right.
So I think there's maybe a connection there of setting the scene for Genesis' return, most likely in Ever Crisis rather than remake for a while. But it's I think it's a good reminder, and it seemed to be pretty well received. So I'm excited. I'm excited for anything that any Final Fantasy VII content that comes our way. Yeah,
especially someone is tied to mythology, as our boy Genesis for sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of here. Future's always bright, and you never know what it holds. So I hope to have checked a bunch off of my list by the next time we sit down.
Good. I'm looking forward to it. So in terms of the last time that we sat down, we did kind of speak about quite a lot of ideas. I think I'd started writing some of the chapters, and was just about to share one with the Kickstarter backers and with my own patrons as well. But a lot of what we discussed was more to do with the things that I'd been researching. So we were kind of looking at the potential connections between Cloud and Theseus, or like the Trojan War and how that might tie into like Crisis Core, and particularly the relationship between Genesis, Angel, and Sephiroth, or Loveless. And then we kind of spoke a little bit about the Gaia chapter that I then released as well, or the chapter. When I say Gaia chapter, what I mean is the sort of mythological links between Gaia's Cliff in Final Fantasy VII and the kind of creation myth that has Gaia, who's Mother Earth, and Uranus, who's sort of Father Sky, and how there's the eventual castration of Uranus, and the sort of violence that came out of that, how that all tied into Gaia and Genova and Final Fantasy VII and whatnot. So that was a good sort of chapter to start on, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
But one of the other things that we did discuss was the Narcissist myth.
Right.
And before we kind of get into the next episode, I want to go back to that very briefly, because as I'd kind of spoken about, I'd kind of looked at the Narcissist myth and I wasn't getting anything jumping out at me, but I think the problem was that I'd approached it from the perspective of Echo, and kind of how Echo lost her voice and whatnot, and then how she met Narcissus and the impact that had on her, rather than the obvious way, I guess, of actually looking at Narcissus'
the direct
origins.
connection. Yeah.
So when you introduced the concept of taking a step back and actually looking at some of the early material for Final Fantasy VII and the ideas that were there, particularly with Sephiroth and Aerith and the relationship. Originally they were going to be brother and sister, and then it was supposed to be a sort of unrequited love story. Right. Both of which tie very, very well into different variations of the Narcissist myth.
That's right.
So when I kind of started looking at that, there were a few little tidbits that kind of started popping up. And one of the story variations includes a prophecy about Narcissus, and the prophecy says that he will live long as he doesn't discover himself. Now, in Narcissus' case, discovering himself meant seeing his reflection, seeing how beautiful he was, and falling in love with himself and whatnot. Right. But in terms of that sort of turn of phrase of discovering himself, I was sort of looking at, well, if you apply that to Sephiroth and Sephiroth's discovery of his true origins, he dies, his Cloud kills him on the night where Sephiroth burns down Nibelheim, which occurs off the back of Sephiroth discovering his own origins. So that prophecy of he will live long as he doesn't discover himself, it could then apply to Sephiroth as well, in that context. And after Narcissus drowns as well, there's an extension to the story where he continues to admire his own reflection as he's sailing across the river Styx, which, one of the things that I'm going to kind of look at, and I'll touch on it later in the episode, is the sort of geography of the underworld, and how there's a lot of rivers, or the geography is, there's quite a lot of water involved in there, in rivers in particular, and how that might connect to the live stream. So there's this continued idea of, after Sephiroth is killed, Cloud throws him into the Mako rivers, and the live stream carries him off. So he is travelling the live stream the same way that Narcissus is crossing the river Styx. But the one that really, really jumped out at me, this is either just or it's likely to be just a massive coincidence, or it's so deeply rooted in Najima's mind.
Raw genius.
Yeah. So, obviously, for this book, I've had to do a huge amount of research, and I've looked at a variety of different writers who have compiled the myths And one of the most famous, if not the most famous, collection of Greek myths was written or published in 1942. It's just called Mythology. It was written by Edith Hamilton. So this has been the sort of benchmark for over 75 years, and it's also one of the first. As far as I can tell from my research, it was also one of the first mythology or European mythology books that was ever translated into Japanese. So, in terms of
interesting
source material for Greek mythology, obviously, back in the day, in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, when the Glory of Heracles series was being written by Kazushige Nojima, the internet, as we know it, didn't exist, which means that it would have had to have sourced the Greek myths from books, or most likely sourced from books. So, if you're going to source it from books, I assume he was reading it in Japanese. And one of the most famous mythology books that was converted or translated into Japanese was this book by Edith Hamilton. So, in the story of Persephone's capture by Hades, Edith Hamilton retells one version where she's captured at a time where she's looking at the Narcissus Flower. So there's something deeper to that I'm not going to get into just yet, but introduces this kind of Narcissus idea that it starts to affect other people as well. But in particular, Hamilton makes a point in the kind of footnotes that pointing out that what in modern days we might understand the Narcissus flower to be, we might call it a daffodil and associate it with like the colours of yellow and white. The version of the Narcissus flower that was typically described in Greek mythology was actually coloured purple and silver. And anybody that's paid any attention to us or Sleepeasy or some of the lore enthusiasts about remake would jump straight out.
It sure does.
So I thought that was pretty interesting. That those specific colours are actually, Hamilton makes a point of specifying that. So as soon as I caught that,
that's excellent. Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
Exactly. So either that's a massive coincidence, or Nojima's had that one up his sleeve for 30 years.
I think, yeah. Both are possible, for sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I've been looking forward to telling you that one.
Wow. I'm excited. Yeah. I've always had kind of a headcanon, relating the two, and comparatively there's a lot of just lines that can be drawn between any of the vanity myths or vanity lessons. It's sort of it's a template. It's an archetype in comparative mythology, and Narcissus has some direct parallels to Lucifer in Abrahamic religion and mythology, just sort of a vanity based, but there's all this identity wrapped into it too. It's so whenever you see a character that's draws heavily on a kind of existential crisis or the response to existentialism that turns inward or self-serving, those are the first two names that generally pop up. But there's, throughout all the myths of the world, it's not an uncommon parable. And so it's hard not to see Sephiroth in that.
Definitely. And I think, when you first sort of mentioned it a couple of months ago, I could see straight away what you were talking about, and it was only after I kind of started to peel away the layers that it was like, I think Baby Seal's onto something here. It's So that's
good.
I guess I've no option but to credit you in the book now.
Oh man, I don't know how you'll handle it.
A free copy coming your way, just as a.
Hey, that sounds good to me. I'd say we're square.
So obviously, like I mentioned earlier, when I was sort of recovering from COVID, I spent a lot of time just kind of focused on the writing, and there was a few more chapters that I've either finished or, I've got pretty much exactly how I want it, and just making the final tweaks on those. And I think I mentioned this to you like way back in the first episode that we ever recorded, but I wanted, when I first started writing the book, I wanted to kind of get the foundation of like some of the big themes and like how the world of Final Fantasy VII worked, like the metaphysics and stuff like that. So, so one of the chapters I looked at was the connection between kind of the ancient water gods in Greek mythology and the ancients, or the Cetra, in Final Fantasy VII. So I was kind of looking at how, like we've touched on this already, like the Forgotten Capital, has a crazy amount of like seabed imagery going on. There's a few connections in the Temple of the Ancients as well. It was kind of looking at that, and then I followed on with looking at the underworld and the function, or how the underworld in Greek mythology functioned versus, the live stream, and how that all tied together. And just for something totally different, the last chapter I sort of looked at was to do with the Phoenix, and the sort of the Phoenix summon. So it's been pretty interesting looking at those. I also kind of took a wee bit of time to kind of research different angles, and again, what you were talking about with Narcissus sort of inspired me to make sure that I'd covered all angles. And one of the things that I picked up on was like a lot of the mythology that I'd studied was to do with like some of the earlier Hellenic pantheon, where Zeus was the primary god, but there were a couple of centuries further down the line where beliefs shifted, and it was less about the sort of natural phenomena and more about day-to-day living, where Demeter and Dionysus became sort of far more prominent, particularly the cults of Dionysus. So I looked into that a little bit more, and how in particular it might connect to Genesis, which
I immediately hearing it. There's a thing that I'm connecting. I don't want to say it. I don't want to say it.
There's a few things that sort of jumped out at me, and I wasn't expecting it. So,
okay.
Like one of the first things is that Dionysus, originally it was one of the kind of god of joy and a god of merriment, but it was very closely tied to being the god of the vine, i.e., wine.
Right,
Bacchus. Yeah. So,
yeah. That's the connection I've made immediately.
So in Crisis Core, obviously Genesis is very deeply connected to the Benona white apples, even though the Benona white trees, the kind of in Crisis Core, when you actually visit Benora, the trees themselves kind of arch over the road, and the design is quite abstractly, you could maybe argue it looks a bit more like a vine. You could also say that the colours of the apples, that kind of deep purple, is also a bit more close to grapes than apples. And randomly, and amongst all that, Genesis was known as the inventor of the Benora white apple juice.
That's right. At 9 years old, or some really young age, he turned this apple into like a delicious drink that became so
popular.
It's a main export of the Shinra corporation.
It's pretty unusual to have that.
Yeah, it's so specific.
Which, I think obviously the word Genesis makes you think of the book of Genesis and
the biblical
sort
figure,
of the Adam and Eve story, and that's probably where the Apple connection comes in. But I've also kind of talked about this in the Norse Myths book and how there's quite a lot of parallels between how Genesis uses the dumb apple versus like the apples of rejuvenation in Norse mythology. But, there was this interesting connection to Dionysus there. One of the other things about Dionysus is that he was kind of celebrated. There was festivals that were held for Dionysus, and the way that he was worshipped, the way that he was celebrated, was to put on plays. So you'd get 5 days. The festivals would last 5 days, and they would the main part of the festival would take place in the amphitheatre, and everyone would go and watch plays, which obviously then connects to Genesis's love for Lovelace.
Right.
And then, a lot of the Dionysus cult, when it became a really quite secret society kind of idea, the part of these Eleusinian mysteries were to do with how we're going to prosper. It's connected to the harvest and all this sort of jazz, and just by the very nature of them, there's not a huge amount of information available. But the fact that they are like the mysteries themselves then kind of harks back to gift of the goddess, mystery of the goddess, all this sort of stuff. So it raised my eyebrow a few times just looking at that. So it's something that, I don't think there's enough there to say yes, absolutely Genesis is based in Dionysus. Because I don't genuinely believe that's the case, but there are quite a few interesting parallels.
Well, I mean, there's a lot actually. It feels like the significance is definitely, the cult of Dionysus, the wine. These are all things that do connect pretty directly. So I wouldn't be surprised if you find more to connect, but time will tell.
One of the followers of Dionysus were quite often described as being frenzied. It was a lot to do with the wine as well, but you could maybe look at the G Army and the connection between. One of the kind of interesting things is that there was. Later on, the sort of as part of the harvest festivals, and this idea of the cycle of life and birth, life, death, rebirth kind of idea. One of the stories was that Dionysus was killed and then reborn, and kind of there's a couple of connections there to how Jesus Christ was perceived, and particularly any association with wine and whatnot. But there's that kind of common theme across many religions of birth, life, death, rebirth, and resurrection and whatnot.
Right.
Which also ties into the Genesis story in Final Fantasy VII of he willingly entombs himself in a cave, and then is resurrected to kind of save the world at the end of Dirge of Cerberus, and the details of which obviously we still know very little about, or nothing about, but there's so again there's these kind of vague allusions between Dionysus and resurrection and Genesis, and so that was quite an interesting one.
Absolutely.
And one of the other ones, I'm not going to get into it too much just now, because this is one that I'm still sort of toying around with, and to see what same idea, of whether or not I can actually get a sizable chunk of information. And this one I could definitely get a sizable chunk of information. There's quite a lot going on. It's whether or not I can justify its own chapter. And it's specific to episode Intermission, which is not something even when I played Intermission, this never jumped out at me. It was only when looking at a connection in Dirge of Cerberus that it dawned on me that there was perhaps a character that from Greek mythology that I could be looking at here. And when I applied the same thing to Intermission, there was quite a lot of parallels that emerged. And again, ones that I certainly didn't expect. So I'm kind of hoping when I do present it, it will be a holy shit kind of moment for a lot of people.
Oh, I see.
So I'll once you've done a bit more exploring down that particular rabbit hole, I'll maybe sort of share a little bit more about it in a future podcast. But yeah, it's been a great wee time, both writing and sort of researching. And when I kind of started working on new chapters, the first one that I kind of picked up was this idea of the importance of water in Greek mythology and how that compared to the importance of water in respect to the ancients, or the Cetra. And particularly, the history of Final Fantasy VII's world. And I don't think, if you're not familiar with Greece or Greek mythology, I don't think it's particularly obvious, but Greek itself is made up of more than 200 islands. So by definition, there's going to be a lot of water involved in...
Right. It's a very, very aquatic nation.
And water plays an important role, right out of the sort of creation myth. At the time where Gaia comes into existence, Gaia being Mother Earth, there's also the sort of primordial sea god Pontus, who is the deep sea. So I kind of looked at Pontus, I looked at Oceanus, who, depending on which creation myth you're looking at, is more often than not just one of the Titans. But Oceanus was the world river, so it was a kind of ever-flowing current that encircled the world, and the Greeks, of course, believed that the world was flat. But what was important about Oceanus is that his offspring were kind of responsible for springs or rivers or streams and whatnot all over Greece, and he was kind of like the border of the world. So if you went beyond Oceanus, you would get to the Underworld, or at least that was Homer's take on it. So it becomes this quite the actual description of Oceanus in Hesiod is the world river that flows around the world, creating life. And it's almost word for word what Marlene describes the live stream to be at the beginning of Advent Children.
The live stream,
it's really quite funny. So I looked at Pontus, I looked at Oceanus, Poseidon, obviously. Poseidon, who after the Olympians took power, he controlled the seas, but he was not the sea himself the way that Pontus was, or he was not the creator of life or creator of currents the way that Oceanus was. He just controlled them. And as I touched on, the Forgotten Capital has a lot of kind of seabed imagery, and one of the cool things that I looked at was the connections between the Forgotten Capital and what limited history we know about it versus the Atlantis myth that Plato kind of talks about. And one of the things that interested me quite a lot was that Kazushige Najima, before he joined Square, the last game that he made was Glory of Heracles 4. And the story, the main character came from Atlantis. And a few of the other characters also came from Atlantis. And the story is at the beginning, Atlantis is attacked and it sinks into the sea. And the civilians go to sleep and their souls wake up in other bodies, like hundreds or thousands of years later.
Wow.
And over the course of the game, you kind of learn little bits and pieces about Atlantis and what remains of it and whatnot.
Yeah, I've never made my way through 4. That's very cool. I had no idea.
That's something that, just when I was kind of researching Najima's past, that was like, okay, the way that the Cetra are presented in Final Fantasy VII, and there's quite a lot of connection to water. It's really quite odd that, like, the last game he made before joining Square was quite heavily influenced by the Atlantis myth. So I look at the allusions there, and there's actually quite a few interesting points. And there's a few kind of unexpected surprises in there as well. I think we kind of touched on previously, like there's a few connections between Poseidon and the Temple of the Ancients as well. There's another one with Poseidon's son, Triton, which, last time round we were talking about, like, the connections with Cloud and Theseus, and Cloud's Nailbat maybe being a take on Theseus's club. And, as soon as you actually enter the interior of the Temple of the Ancients, the first item box you open has Sid's trident in it.
That's true.
But there's another one as well that's for Kate Sith, or Kotshi, that he gets the trumpet shell. Now, the trumpet shell, when you look at it in the Ultimani Omega, is actually a conch shell, and that's what the symbol for Triton was.
Oh, wow.
He would go about sort of announcing Poseidon's arrival, or he was kind of like the Hermes of the sea, like he was the messenger of the sea. But that's what he did.
Right.
He would sort of declare things through this conch shell. So you've got, I don't think it's a coincidence that in the Temple of the Ancients, where the ancients are already established to be connected to water, you've got both the icon of Poseidon and Triton.
Yeah. Wow.
And one of my favourite ones as well is that I'll tell you this now. It's because it's
okay.
As
you got me on my tippy toes here.
Between the Temple of the Ancients and between entering the Temple of the Ancients and arriving at the Forgotten Capital, the player is able to pick up 2 summon materia. Right? So, can you remember what was there? Okay,
no,
so
tell me.
In the Temple of the Ancients, after you fight the Red Dragon, you get Bahamut.
Right?
And in the Sleeping Forest, you get Kujata.
Oh, you get Kujata.
Now, anyone that knows their mythology know that comes from sort of early Islamic Arabian mythology. Okay.
Right.
So in terms of Bahamut, prior to working on Final Fantasy VII, prior's not the right word, simultaneous to working on Final Fantasy VII, Kazushika Najima was also directing Bahamut Lagoon, which was written by Toriyama. Now, part of Toriyama's job during the development of Final Fantasy VII was he was an event planner, or an event scenario writer.
Right.
Quite specifically, a lot of the scenes between Cloud and Aerith were written by Toriyama.
Oh.
And one of the few places in the game, after the kind of Sector 5 scenario, where it's mandatory to have Cloud and Aerith in the party, is the Temple of the Ancients, which suggests that Toriyama probably had a hand in the dialogue or what was going on in the Temple of the Ancients, right? So we've got a scenario where Najima and Toriyama's game that they worked on, while Final Fantasy VII was going on, was Bahamut Lagoon. So the likelihood that neither of them knew what the origin of Bahamut was is very unlikely. So, getting the Bahamut summon in the Temple of the Ancients is probably a nod to that. But the actual mythology behind Bahamut, or what Bahamut is in mythology, is he's a cosmic fish, which brings us right back to the water.
Right. That's right. The dirty truth is that the draconic Bahamut that we know of is just ripped directly from the pages of Dungeons and Dragons, but as an actual deity, Bahamut is more akin to Leviathan. If that, it's a muddy fish, a muddy giant fish god. That is that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point.
So, it gets better. Okay, so what creature is it that stands on Bahamut's back? The answer is Kujata.
Okay, hold on. My mind's starting to freak out here. Okay, so we do get those back to back.
Okay,
wow.
So I think those two back to back is an allusion to the two devs working on Bahamut Lagoon. Bahamut being a cosmic fish is an allusion to water. Poseidon, like we discussed last time, is very, very closely associated with bulls as well.
Right, and so to wrap this full circle, because my brain was kind of just in awe. What we're saying is that Kuyota or Kujata in Final Fantasy is a bull which Bahamut stands upon. It's carried upon, and the bull, by the way, is probably where we get Behemoth, like the idea that there was a mix up of Bahamut and Kuyota, somewhere in the translation of comparative mythology, as the tales were told and passed from mouth to mouth, the details were switched, and so even though, like, from an etymological standpoint, you would say Bahamut or Behemoth sounds like Bahamut. Mythologically, Behemoth, and biblically, Behemoth is represented as more of a bull-like creature, and that's because the bull and the fish were switched with each other, whereas Leviathan took on the fish of the fish-like serpentine appearance and I guess you would say identity when it made its way to Arabic mythology and Islamic mythology. So there was this bizarre set of circumstances that sort of say that Bahamut, Leviathan, even Behemoth, and Tiamat, in an unrelated thing, are all probably referring to the same being, the same cosmic being. And you're right. This represents like an opportunity for them to correct the misunderstanding. It's like the first, sort of accurate reference to the two, given the timing that you get them. That's very interesting. That's very, very, I'd never really thought of the fact that you got those two back to back. That's great. Great find.
Thanks.
Great find, Mo.
So yeah. And there's some, just because that chapter deals quite specifically with the sort of water illusions, I threw although we go off at a tangent and talk about like very early Islamic sort of mysticism and
water deities.
It's worth having in there just because I think it's really quite interesting.
Absolutely.
So kind of off the back of that, like as I mentioned earlier, like because Greece itself has a lot of water, it makes sense that they would also imagine their afterlife to contain a lot of water. So in mythology, from a geographical perspective, in the kind of the early literature from Homer, in the Odyssey, Homer describes Odysseus accessing the afterlife by crossing over Oceanus, who circled the world at its perimeter, and then sort of in later mythology, there were the underworld was located beneath the ground and could be accessed from the land. But even then, it was made up of 5 great rivers, and there was a lake of fire, and and all sorts of various bits and pieces depending on the author of the mythology. Which
sure,
that kind of idea ties quite nicely into the previous chapter in terms of the mythology, but there's when we think about the afterlife in Final Fantasy VII, of course, it's the live stream, and as much as this is a kind of spiritual plane, there's the words that are used for the live stream. It's again going back to the Marlene description at the beginning of Advent Children of it's the river of life that flows through the planet. It does evoke this idea of it being an actual moving, flowing,
river,
fluid entity. So I think there's definitely some comparisons to be made between the waters of the Greek underworld and the live stream, or just kind of going off at a tangent. Like one of the rivers in the Greek underworld is the River Lethe, which is the river of forgetfulness. Which, although that's not quite how Mako poisoning works, a lot of Final Fantasy VII stories, the sort of Cloud's misidentity and how he's forgotten who he really is, and in order to recapture his identity, he has to go into the live stream with Tifa to get it. So it's not quite the underworld, but it's still this principle of being in the live stream. So there's perhaps a little connection there between Cloud's identity and the river of forgetfulness.
Absolutely.
I kind of look at, obviously because we're talking about the underworld, it would be remiss of me not to kind of touch on like the actual Hades summon, of course from Final Fantasy VII. But Hades is a kind of weird one, because anyone that's familiar with Greek mythology will know that the Hades in Final Fantasy VII has very little to do with Hades and mythology. The way that it's sort of presented in the game is this like kind of skeletal Grim Reaper, black cloak, druid over a cauldron kind of stuff, which kind of weird, like that sort of Grim Reaper look isn't quite what Hades was in mythology. Like Hades ruled the underworld, but it wasn't like the god of death or anything like that. That was Thanatos. So Thanatos had a, in some descriptions was perhaps closer to how Hades appears in 7. And like witchcraft as well wasn't really a big thing in Greek mythology. Like there's no sort of wizards or druids or anything like that. There's a few witches. Like there's a goddess, Hecate, who's got a bit of witchcraft, and there's actual witches that show up, like Circe shows up in the Odyssey, and Medea shows up in the Jason, the Golden Fleece story. But we're you could probably count on one hand the number of witches that appear in Greek mythology. Right. So to have sort of Hades represented that way is a bit unusual. But one of the things that I did want to go into is that because the way that the live stream is, and again we're kind of talking about water and the connections to the rivers of the Greek underworld. My friend Dan Hume, who goes by the name of Dionysus at Final Fantasy forums, he writes mythology articles as well, and they're absolutely phenomenal. And one of the ones I did was about Hades, and he pointed out that there seems to be this unusual connection across the games, where Hades is linked to the deep sea. Like in Final Fantasy VII, which is where Hades first showed up. Right. You obtain the Hades Materia in the sunken Guernica at the bottom of the sea. Final Fantasy IX, you fight Hades in Memoria by, there's this kind of room that you go into that it's supposed to be the seabed. And if you go off to the side, you can fight Hades. Hope this isn't much of a spoiler for many people, but like Emmett Selk in Final Fantasy XIV, Emmett Selk is a title. His actual name is Hades.
Yes, and that's right.
The whole idea of kind of the stories that he's recreated Amarot at the bottom of a lake. So again, you've got this deep water connection with Hades. So it's quite cool that there seems to be this connection, albeit the summon itself is not quite there. But the chapter kind of looks at other bits and pieces as well, like Hades. Like, as much as it was a god of the underworld, like later on, either because of Greek mentality or just like the way the Greeks did with the Furies, that they didn't call them the Erinyes, they called them what was it, like the delightful ones, or do you know what I'm talking about, where they were so afraid of the Furies that they called them this really pleasant name.
Well, we'll come back to it. I'll remember.
So the same sort of idea kind of happened with Hades a bit further down the line, where he was kind of equated with like a god of wealth. So this is where the name Pluto came from. So Hades and Pluto are the same person, or Pluton as he's sometimes known as well. And the idea
the gracious ones. It was the gracious ones.
There we go.
Yeah. There you go.
So like the wealth itself was to do with the harvest and sure. But it was also connected to the idea that jewels come out of the earth, or gemstones. Mm-hmm. Which kind of got me thinking of, okay, well, if I'm going to look at the Greek underworld and its connections to the live stream, then the highest concentration of live stream that appears in Final Fantasy VII is at Gaia's Cliff. And at Gaia's Cliff, the weapon emerge. And the weapon are named after jewels. Like, and in particular, the context of that one is that the Northern Cave seems to be like one of these locations where it's like an entrance to the underworld. Because while there's not a huge amount of Greek mythology that appears within the Northern Cave, but there's a lot of underworld, like some of the beasts that you encounter, like like zombie dragon and things like that. But like Ahriman is one of them. Ahriman is not quite the king of hell, but like the leader of the underworld in Zoroastrianism.
Right.
So there is this idea that as you descend into the northern cave, you're descending into hell, you're descending into the underworld. So if that's where the weapon emerged from, there's maybe this connection between, is that how the weapon got the name? Kind of idea?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it kind of looks at a few bits and pieces. And the last one that like I said I was working on was the Phoenix chapter. Just I reckon that as a preview chapter, that's probably the one I'm going to do next. Just because it's nice and it's far more compact than some of the other chapters. Like all three of the other chapters are like 20 plus pages, whereas the Phoenix one's really quite it's nice and it's tidy and it's okay. We're going to just talk about like how Phoenix appears in Final Fantasy VII as a summon and then appears in Crisis Core as well, and the sort of placement of the materia is quite important. Like without getting into too much, like to get the Phoenix Materia at Fort Condor in Final Fantasy VII, the actual Condor itself, the adult Condor, dies, and the chick emerges from the egg, and that's where the Phoenix Materia comes from. So it's this idea of, adult Phoenix dies, child Phoenix rises from the ashes, kind of idea. Same thing with Nibelheim, that it's in the water tower. And you can obtain the Phoenix Materia from the Nibelheim water tower, but Nibelheim itself also represents this idea of rising from the ashes, because it's obviously Sephiroth burns it down and it then gets rebuilt. One of the things actually that I found while I was researching this that I thought was quite interesting is that the Phoenix over the centuries has symbolised a variety of different things, but it came to be symbolised in sort of early Christianity or it came to be equated in early Christianity with baptism. Just being reborn in Christ and whatnot.
Right.
Which might also explain the water tower. Why it's in the water tower. So that was a cool wee potential connection there. But there's kind of looking at the Phoenix as well, like the actual design of it in 7 and in Crisis Core, they're pretty different, but both of them actually do relate to different descriptions in mythology. Like the one in Crisis Core is really quite close to how Pliny the Elder describes it. There's a few pretty cool bits and pieces that are just going about, and obviously the Phoenix Down as well, and why why using Phoenix Downs raises a party member and all this jazz. So it goes into it a little bit that way, just to sort of provide a bit of context. And I'm kind of sure, or I'm almost certain that we'll see it in remake as well. But pretty sure the Phoenix appears on the painting in Aerith's room in remake.
It does appear to.
So it's got that sort of peacock look about it, which is again quite a common way of depicting a phoenix. So it's not wildly inaccurate by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, yeah, not at all. And there's always some a little bit of cross blending with some South American deities. Mm-hmm. Too, when they design Phoenix, especially in Final Fantasy XIV, etc.
Yeah.
Final Fantasy VII is the first, It's the first time we see Phoenix as a summon.
And it's Final Fantasy V, actually, is the first.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's in 5 and it's in 6. But 5 was like a proper flaming bird idea. Like, it wasn't, the design of it was pretty different. But there's like a story about Phoenix was supposed to appear in Final Fantasy 3. Like, Amano did artwork for it, but they cut it last minute for some reason. But it's still in the game code.
Right, it's as an enemy.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, there's there's a little bit of kind of backstory to it within the Final Fantasy series, but by the time it gets to 7, there's it's quite interesting. There's a few things in there that you might not expect.
Really?
Yeah, in terms of the
the history of Final Fantasy 3 and 4 and. Or 3, 5, and I guess 6.
What I mean is, in terms of little tidbits of information, little tidbits of connections between the Phoenix myth, and the Phoenix myth and how it's presented in Final Fantasy 7 in particular. Like the kind of the hatching of the egg kind of idea. There's a lesser known Phoenix myth to do with an egg. Which I won't get into just now because it's little, it's kind of, it'll take a wee bit of time to explain, but so there's the whole Fort Condor side of things is actually quite interesting, and how that connects to the Phoenix myth, because there's quite a few layers to it.
Interesting, very, very interesting. And I know that there's in terms of the Phoenix, there's some discourse on Greece not being the true origin of Phoenix. There's a possibility that it's a borrowed concept from ancient Egyptian mythology. There's sacred birds, and there's even a possibility that it was in fact called the Phoenix. But that's been pretty disputed, and it's kind of a dead end. The most sort of dictated variant of the Phoenix that we know and that most of our culture draws on is the Mycenaean Greek, and it sort of just meant like it meant like a mythical bird, like it was probably a analog to griffin, what we would call the griffin. So
as I think because over time the descriptions of it and what it symbolised actually changed so much that it would be impossible to say with absolute certainty whether it was Greek or Egyptian or otherwise.
Right.
So many other cultures have very similar.
Right.
The Baltic states have their version. The Persians had one version. The Far East have multiple versions.
Right. It's a pretty universal motif. It's a mythological motif. It might even be numbered. I'm not sure if you're familiar with like motif indexing with folk literature and stuff like that. But,
I've heard of this, but I'm not too familiar with it. But I think even the myths themselves, the sort of, is it Egyptian, is it Greek? By the time it got to Herodotus, his description of it was that it lived in Arabia anyway. Was
right. So it described the actual locale as Egypt. Yeah.
So it was, so it was. There's a lot to be disputed, and I think I think nowadays most scholars agree that, you know, the Greeks have got a pretty good claim. There's sort of literature that's credited to Hesiod in like the 6th century BC that mentions the Phoenix. And I can't remember if it's Mycenaean or Minoan culture. It seems to have reference to it as well, but that might be the Griffin thing that you were talking about. So yeah, but I mean, for the purposes of the book, I'm just going to throw it in anyway. Like, yeah, if readers want to dispute its presence in the Greek mythology book, then
that would be you can fight you. Yeah, let it be known, readers. Mo's willing to fight. Okay,
handbags are out. So just before we kind of start closing up, is there anything kind of that we've brought up that kind of got the old brain juices going?
I'm going to keep some to myself, but I am really excited.
Thank you. Yeah,
really excited.
And the way the whole thing's coming together, I'm thrilled with it. You know, I'm having a huge amount of fun. And during these podcasts, I find myself really quite. I think I share a lot, but there's a lot that I bite my tongue over and want to hold back because there's. I do want to. I'm hopeful that when people kind of read the book for the first time, that, you know, they'll have those moments of, you know, they have to stop reading because it's given them that wow moment, because there's so many things that I've found during my research and looking at it through this, you know, the specific lens of Greek mythology, where it's really kind of caught my breath. So I really, really hope that I can sort of reproduce that for readers. And as I've kind of mentioned before, this book's actually going to be significantly longer than the Norse myths one.
Right. Which is very exciting news.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, I guess, you know, as I've touched on before, like, given the volume of source material, that was kind of inevitable.
Right.
I think the mistake that I made was sort of looking at surface level, sort of name drops and references in the compilation, and just saying, okay, well, we've got X number of things that I can look into now. And then when you start to kind of peel back the layers a little bit and think, okay, right, I can actually see parallels here where there was not specific name drops. You know, like the Intermission one, for example, like the character that I'm from Greek mythology that I'm talking about doesn't get name dropped anywhere. But when you kind of highlight it, it starts to become quite obvious that it's there. So hopefully, you know, get to share some more of that one pretty soon.
Yes.
Like I said, once the Phoenix chapter is kind of tidied up and sent off to the editor and stuff, that'll probably be the next preview. So I'm hoping to get that out, you know, within the next month. And I've also started doing video calls with the Gaia tier Kickstarter backers. So I had a call.
Oh, great!
I had a call with Ryan in Australia last week, which was amazing. You know, it's so good to be able to connect, and have conversations.
It's one of my favorite things
with people that, you know, believe in what I'm doing, and you know have literally put their money on the table to show how much they value this. And you know, I can't even begin to describe how grateful I am for that. So being able to have these conversations is hugely fulfilling for me. So I'm kind of moving forward with that. So all the messages have been sent out. So if you are a Gaia tier backer and you haven't got back to me yet, do feel free to drop me a message anytime. But before we go, is there anything else that you would like to let people know about, Baby Seal?
Well, let's see. I just I will be on Final Fan TV's Wheel of Final Fantasy as the returning champion. I was part of the only team to win that game, and so as punishment, Daniel from Final Fan TV has made a impossible puzzle for me, Blitz, and Legions.
Nice. I can't
And
wait to see
so
this.
that should be available for you all Friday, April 1st, and I think the joke's going to be on me. And then please look forward to 2 episodes of SEAL Team 7. And, realistically, I think we're going to see legitimate Final Fantasy 7 related project news from the developers, within the next few months. That's very significant. So
Excellent.
I think we should all look forward to that. And, but most of all, I'm looking forward to this book. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Well, from Baby Seal and I just want to thank the Kickstarter backers again. You guys are awesome. And to everyone that's listened to the podcast, we really appreciate it. So take care of yourself, and we'll speak to you soon.